In this story, an 8-year-old girl walks into a wheat field in Wyoming and follows something that shouldn't have been there. She's gone for 9 hours. When she comes back, everyone in the story agrees on that much. What nobody in the account can agree on is what she was saying when she returned. Because according to the story, the sounds coming out of her mouth weren't English, weren't any language her family recognized, and weren't anything 3 linguists in the account could ever place. She spoke for 5 hours straight. This is the story of what she said, and of how almost every trace of it quietly disappeared. In this fictional account, the story is set in a small farming town called Widow's Basin, tucked into a high desert valley in southern Wyoming in September of 1971. The town, in the narrative, has fewer than 300 people, 1 general store, 1 church, and a single-room schoolhouse that all 8 grades share. The story describes it as the kind of place where nothing much happens, which is part of why what allegedly happened to 8-year-old Callie Reed became impossible for the town to forget, and impossible, within the fiction, for the family to ever fully put down. According to the account, Callie was playing near the edge of her family's wheat field on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Her older brother, Peter, 15, had gone inside an hour earlier to help their mother can vegetables for the winter. Her mother, Helen Reed, was in the kitchen with the radio on low. The story describes the day as unremarkable. Clear sky, mild wind, nothing that would suggest anything was about to happen. Helen would later tell the story's fictional researcher that she remembered thinking, of all things, that it was a good drying day for laundry. Then, in the narrative, Callie is said to have seen something standing at the tree line at the far edge of the field. Tall, thin, pale gray, with a head the story describes as too large for its body and eyes that seemed, in Callie's own words as later recorded in the account, to catch light like a cat's, but bigger and darker at the same time. The story has her say it didn't speak in words, but that she felt something. A pull. A question she said she heard inside her chest rather than her ears. The way you feel someone call your name from another room before you're sure you actually heard it. So she followed it. According to the account, that was the last anyone saw of Callie until nearly 11 that night, when Peter, unable to sleep and increasingly frightened as the search widened, found her standing motionless at the back door. Upright, eyes open, not crying, not visibly hurt, dust on her shoes but nowhere else on her clothes, staring at a fixed point on the kitchen wall, and talking. In the story, the search that Helen and Peter mounted in the hours before Callie reappeared is described in some detail. Neighbors roused from bed, trucks lined up along the field's edge with headlights aimed at the corn rows, someone's dog sent in twice and coming back both times refusing to go a third. The narrative lingers on this part deliberately because it's the part everyone in town agreed on before the stranger details ever entered the story. A child was missing for hours in a place small enough that everyone knew everyone, and nobody, in the account, could explain how she simply wasn't found until she chose to reappear on her own. But according to the story, what came out of Callie's mouth over the next 5 hours wasn't panic, and it wasn't gibberish. And that distinction is where this account starts to get difficult to explain away. In the narrative, Helen Reed's first instinct is that her daughter is praying or reciting something memorized out of fear, the way children sometimes repeat a nursery rhyme when they're overwhelmed. She tries to interrupt, tries to sit Callie down, offers her water, even tries gently shaking her shoulder. In the story, none of it works. Callie keeps talking, steady and unbroken, her eyes never quite focusing on the room around her, for 5 straight hours. Peter, in the account, has a small reel-to-reel recorder he uses for music, a hand-me-down from before their father left the family 2 years earlier. And the story has him think, almost on instinct, to turn it on partway through, catching perhaps 3 of the 5 hours in total. Those recordings, within the fiction, are what eventually draw a linguist into the story nearly 6 months later, after a family friend who taught at the local college mentions the case almost in passing to a colleague. Here is the part of the narrative worth being careful about. The story doesn't describe what Callie said as noise. It describes a fictional linguist, we'll call her Dr. Vivian Ash, reviewing the recordings and, according to the account, noting structured, repeating sound patterns that resembled grammar rather than random vocalization. In the story, Dr. Ash writes in her private notes that the vocal patterns show something like consistent word building, the kind of structure real linguists associate with certain human language families, but that she can't match it to any language she or her colleagues in the story can identify, despite weeks spent comparing it against reference recordings from dozens of known languages. According to the narrative, Dr. Ash spends months on the recordings, increasingly convinced there's something worth documenting properly. She reaches out, in the story, to colleagues at other universities, describing what she's found in careful, hedged academic language. She submits a partial transcription for review, and the account says it's turned down without explanation. Not rejected on the merits, simply returned, unread as far as she could tell. It's important to be direct here. None of this is real correspondence, and no real university or journal is involved. It's the shape the fictional story uses to dramatize how, in stories like this one, expert curiosity tends to run into walls that are never fully explained within the narrative itself. In the story, Dr. Ash stops writing about the case entirely after 1973, and never mentions it again in any of her later published work, a silence the narrative treats as its own kind of mystery, one that outlives her own career. The account places Widow's Basin inside a wider fictional region the story treats as unusually active. A high desert valley the narrative claims has, within the world of the story, an unusually dense cluster of strange local incidents in the years around Callie's encounter. In the story, a rancher 40 miles away reports livestock found dead under circumstances the local account describes as unexplained. No blood at the scene, no tracks, an official explanation of predation that the narrative says never quite satisfied anyone locally, and that shifted twice more before the county simply stopped commenting on it. A separate fictional incident, roughly a year earlier, describes several unrelated townspeople reporting low, silent lights moving over the valley on the same recurring nights, always clustered around the new moon, always gone by sunrise. A third invented thread involves a fictional survey team who, according to the story, loses track of nearly 3 hours during a mapping expedition on a nearby ridge. Each of them independently describing a light moving along the ground rather than the sky, and each of their watches, in the narrative, showing a different, incorrect time when they compared notes that evening, a detail none of the three could ever explain to the other's satisfaction. To be clear, these are fictional details built to give the town's world a lived-in, unsettling texture, not claims about any real region's documented history. The story is not asserting that any of this happened in the real world. It's establishing why, within the narrative, Callie's family felt like their experience fit into something larger already circling their community, something the valley itself seemed to carry. And according to the story, that sense of something larger is exactly what made Helen Reed keep private notes on her daughter for years afterward. Notes that, within the narrative, would eventually matter more than anyone in the family expected them to. The story also describes how the town itself changed, in small ways, after that September. According to the account, fewer families let their children play unsupervised near the field edges after dark, an unspoken rule nobody voted on but everyone seemed to follow. The general store owner, in the narrative, is said to have kept a hand-drawn map behind the counter marking where different neighbors claim to have seen lights over the years, adding a new pin every so often, never quite willing to take the map down. It's a small, quiet detail, and the story treats it as exactly that. Not proof of anything, just the texture of a community quietly living alongside a story it never fully resolved. In the account, Helen Reed, untrained in linguistics, a farmer's wife with a high school education and 2 years of bookkeeping from a community college, sits at her kitchen table during Callie's 5-hour episode and writes down what she hears as best she can, letter by letter, in a spiral notebook she otherwise used for grocery lists. The story reproduces a short invented phrase from that fictional notebook, Athori Salin, Corinuta Solano. Within the narrative, 2 unnamed linguists review the phrase independently, years apart, and both describe the sound clusters as consistent with an agglutinative structure, the kind of language family that builds meaning by stacking word segments, the way Turkish or Finnish do in the real world. while being unable to place the specific vocabulary in any known family, ancient or modern. One of the story's fictional linguists is given a line that becomes the emotional center of the narrative. The strange part isn't that I can't identify the words, it's that I can recognize the grammar. Whatever this is, it has rules. That's not something a frightened child invents on the spot. Again, this is fiction. There is no real notebook, no real linguists, no real analysis. It's a device the story uses to raise its central, unanswerable question. What would it mean, within this narrative, if an 8-year-old with no exposure to any foreign language had, however briefly, produced something structured enough to look like real language, rather than simply sounding like one to untrained ears? The story adds that in the months following the episode, Callie is described doing small, strange things, pausing mid-conversation to tilt her head as if listening to something just outside the range of ordinary hearing, drawing detailed, nested geometric patterns her teacher found unusually precise for her age, triangles inside triangles, repeated for pages at a time. And twice, in November of that year and again the following January, she's found standing in the yard at night, lips moving silently, facing the same direction of sky each time. When her mother asks what she's doing, the story has Callie answer with one word: answering. According to the narrative, that single word, answering, not praying, not talking to herself, is what convinces Helen Reed that whatever her daughter experienced that September night wasn't over and might never fully be. Here, the fictional story takes its biggest turn, and it's a turn about absence, not revelation. In the narrative, Dr. Ash's recordings are said to have been cataloged by a university department in early 1972, given accession numbers that a later fictional researcher can still trace in old departmental logs, then quietly removed from its archives sometime in the mid-1970s, with no surviving transfer record explaining where they went or who authorized it. Helen Reed's private notebook, in the story, is later lost in a house fire that also claims most of the family's other papers. The fictional researcher who first wrote up the case, years afterward, has his own files destroyed in a separate, unrelated incident. Peter Reed, in the narrative, never speaks publicly about that night before his death decades later, taking whatever he remembered of those 3 recorded hours with him. Every piece of evidence in this fictional account, by design, ends up a copy of something that no longer exists, which is exactly the shape the story is built around, not a claim about anything that actually happened. Within the narrative, this pattern raises the story's central open question, one it deliberately never answers. Was Callie Reed given something real that night? Some structured, transmittable system of meaning? Or did a frightened, isolated community simply build a legend around a traumatized child's dissociative episode? The kind of explanation that, within the story, has just as much narrative weight as the stranger one, and arguably fits the facts just as neatly? The account doesn't resolve that question. It's built specifically not to, because the mystery, within this story, was never really about proving what happened. It's about how thoroughly something can vanish, real or not, once no one is left to hold on to it. The story spends a little time on Helen Reed's later years, describing a woman who, by the account, never brought the subject up unprompted, but never once wavered when someone else did. Neighbors are said to have described her as calm about it in a way that unsettled them more than hysteria would have. Not defensive, not evangelical, just quietly certain, the way a person is certain about something they watched happen with their own eyes rather than something they were told. The narrative offers no way to verify that certainty, only the fact of it, sitting steadily at the center of an otherwise unprovable story. To be clear one more time, this is a work of fiction. There is no real Callie Reed, no real Dr. Vivian Ash, no real Widow's Basin, and no verified recordings, notebooks, or academic correspondence behind any part of this story. The setting is an invented composite, not a claim about any real town, region, or documented case. What the story is really built around is a familiar human shape, a family carrying something strange and unprovable, a piece of evidence that keeps almost but not quite surviving long enough to be examined. and the space between "this really happened" and "this is the story a frightened town needed to tell itself" to make sense of one unexplainable afternoon. Within the fiction, Callie grows up, and the story leaves her future deliberately vague. A woman in her later years who, the account suggests without confirming, may still tilt her head sometimes and listen, may still move her lips toward the sky some nights, carrying a language nobody else on Earth can read, or carrying nothing at all but the story her town built around a very long day when she was 8. If a story like this makes you wonder how easily a real, ordinary explanation and a genuinely strange one can look identical from a distance, that tension is a big part of why stories like this stick with people, whether or not any single detail in them checks out. The story closes without ever telling you which explanation to believe, the ordinary one or the stranger one. Because within this narrative, both of them cost the Reed family something, and both of them, in their own way, are still sitting unresolved in that valley decades later. If you like mystery storytelling like this, subscribe for more original stories every week. And in the comments, I want to know, if you'd been in that kitchen that night, what would you have believed you were hearing?